very, very pleased to have alongside me a very, very well-known person within motorsport, not just in Formula One, but of course W Series. Matt Bishop, the communications director from W Series, joins me. Hi, Matt. How are you? It's good to see you keeping well.
Thank you very much, and you too, Alex.
Now, obviously, at the Turkish Grand Prix this past week, we saw a milestone being matched. That now 7-time Formula One world champion Lewis Hamilton secured his. I cannot believe that the era of Schumacher, in some respects, has been slightly better, but also matched. And Matt, you had the pleasure of working with Lewis as communications manager back at McLaren through 2008 until Lewis's departure in 2012 before he joined Mercedes. What were your first overriding emotions when he crossed the line, having started 6th in what was, I think, one of the most exciting Grand Prix I think I've seen all season long, to equal Michael's tally?
Well, first of all, let's talk about the race before we talk about the tally. I mean, that was an extraordinary motor race. Lewis Hamilton had struggled for pace, struggled for tyre temperature, struggled for grip all the way through. And when we woke up on Sunday morning, people were saying, you know, could Lance Stroll win? Could Checo Perez win? Probably Max Verstappen will win. And we were chucking around these ideas. Nobody really wrote off Lewis Hamilton's chances, but nobody, by the same token, was talking about them, because this was one race that he didn't look like winning. And then what happened? He bided his time and he won his 94th Formula One Grand Prix. And he won it in style, and he won it by miles. And I think it's a defensible position to say it was one of his very, very greatest race victories. He didn't have the fastest car. And I think he could have won that race in a Red Bull. I think he could have won that race in a Racing Point. I think he could have won that race in just about anything. That was a definitive example that one can always point to when people say of Lewis Hamilton, but it's just the car, isn't it? Yes, he's got the best car. By the way, Fangio always had the best car. Senna almost always had the best car. And of course, the best drivers generally have the best car. But Lewis Hamilton in Turkey showed that he can win with something that wasn't the best car. So look, I thought that was a fantastic performance. As regards winning 7 world championships, I mean, extraordinary. I was amazed when Michael did that, because of course, when I fell in love with the sport as a boy, you know, Fangio's 5 world championships seemed grotesquely out of touch, out of reach for anyone. Then Prost got 4. Then, you know, eventually Michael came along and got 7. And at that point I thought, right, that is it. That is going to be the margin. That is like Lester Piggott's, you know, 9 Derby wins. Nobody's ever going to do that. But now Lewis has gone and done it. And he'll probably do 8. And he might do 9. And who knows what he's going to do. But I think it's quite an astonishing magnum opus. And a lot of people criticize Lewis. He's very Marmite. Some people like him and some people don't. I will put my cards on the table. I'm an enormous fan. Of course, I worked with him for 5 years. I'm sure you're going to ask me about that. But, you know, he is an absolute GOAT, G-O-A-T, greatest of all time. In my book, right up there with Fangio, right up there with Clark, right up there with Senna, and Schumacher and Prost, and whoever else you want to wind into that podium. Basically, everybody's top 5 consists of about 15 people, doesn't it?
It always does, Matt, because you can never put so many different people on such a pedestal. You know, you run out of time. Like, for instance, Matt is very prolific on the hashtag on this day, which is something that I really love. It brings back all the classic moments, remembering people's birthdays of people that are no longer with us within the pantheon of motorsport. But, you know, you can't, in some respects, you can look at eras, but you can't necessarily compare them. Am I right?
Well, of course you can't. I mean, it's fun to try, isn't it? It's fun to try. It's fun to try to compare Stanley Matthews with Lionel Messi. You know, it doesn't really get you anywhere. It's a messy comparison, I could say. But the same applies if somebody says, oh yeah, Fangio definitely better than Hamilton. That's not really a defensible position any more than it's defensible to say that Hamilton is better than Fangio. It's fun to do so. It's fun to have the debate. It's a pity we're in lockdown, because it'd be nice to do it with a few pints in a pub, but instead of which we do it on Zoom and on Twitter and so on and so forth. But I think you can still talk about the greats in any sport, and Lewis is definitely a great. And in this era, he is the greatest.
I think one of the biggest things that stood out to me, which not a lot of people have actually mentioned on Twitter, is the fact that Sebastian Vettel, who was the man that was tipped to possibly break Michael's records, was the first person to congratulate him. I think it was the first time that we had seen Sebastian on a podium this season, showing how good he actually is, because he started 11th. He picked off, I think it was at least 6 positions. I think even in the first lap when Valtteri and Esteban spun off of the exit of turn number 1. And that was a big turning point, because we knew that if Valtteri could keep with Lewis, the championship would have gone to Bahrain, with it still being on the table for both of the Mercedes drivers. And that was a real testament to Sebastian's, very much in the way that when Felipe lost the title to Lewis at Interlagos that season in 2008, and the sportsmanship from the pair of them speaks volumes, just how credible Lewis is, not just as a sportsman, but also as an individual.
Yeah, I think it was very fitting that Vettel, who has had a bad season, obviously, in terms of results we know, but it was very fitting that there he was on the podium when Lewis made history in this way. And yes, it was nice to see him congratulate Lewis. By the way, I just apropos this whole subject, I heard a statistic the other day which staggered me, which is that Lewis has won 3 Drivers' World Championships since he last had a DNF. Just imagine that for a second. Just sit and ponder that.
I mean, we have to give credit to Toto Wolff, the whole team at Mercedes-AMG Petronas, at both Brackley and also Brixworth, Brixworth as well. Especially, you can't forget one person that has been, I think that is a person that isn't really talked about, is the former head of HPP, and that is Andy Cowell. And I have to give props to a good friend, Scott Mitchell from the race, for his lengthy, detailed descriptions of the 3 engines that Mercedes brought about. They had the one that was 250 kilos and was literally engine indestructible. They had one that had the top end of power and the bottom end of reliability, to really give Mercedes a good handle. And that, Matt, has really been one of the big keys to their success as well. It's not just been about Lewis, it's also been about the fact that Mercedes have been so driven through Toto, through Dr. Obviously the former chair of Mercedes, Dr. Dieter Zetscher, and now Ola Kalinius is now head of Mercedes. They've done a great job, and they picked up the ball big time in 2014 when everyone seemed to have dropped it, including Red Bull and Renault.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, I've been a journalist. I've been in Formula One on and off for 25 years, more than 25 years. But the beginning part, I was a journalist, and then I worked in teams, McLaren for 10 years, as you may know. But the interesting transition from that is to when you begin to work in a team, in the center of a team, you realize what a team sport this is. People talk about, Lewis Hamilton won the championship this year. Of course he did, but actually Mercedes won the championship this year. Yes, of course Lewis did a brilliant job. And won the races. But, there are hundreds of people. I always think it's an interesting thing. If you ask someone who won the Turkish Grand Prix, they'll say, oh, Hamilton. You said, who won the Le Mans 24-hour race? They'll say Toyota. They won't say the driver's name. It's more obviously a team sport, World Endurance Championship, WEC, but actually Formula One is just as much. I just want to go back to Massa, because you mentioned Massa, Interlagos 2008. And of course, I was in the garage as a McLaren communications director at the time, having worked very, very closely with Lewis already that year. I mean, extraordinary moments, of course, which we could go into detail about if you want, but specifically, you asked about Felipe Massa. I think, of course, Lewis was the hero of the day. He won the World Championship, but Felipe Massa won the race in front of his home crowd. And when he crossed the line, he thought he'd won the World Championship. And we all can bring to mind those video images from the Ferrari garage when his poor father thought that his son had won the World Championship. And then that look of alarming recognition came across his face. And then the Ferrari mechanic headbutted the monitor, and there's glass smithereens everywhere. And then Lewis was declared champion. Felipe got up on the podium, his hand on his chest, tears coursing down his cheeks, and, you know, incredible dignity. And I'm going to tell you a little story about that, because about half an hour after that, I was with Lewis in the paddock, and there were a million cameras and a million camera operators and dictaphones here and microphones here and TV sound booms and photographers with lenses. Pandemonium in a tiny paddock. Of course, it's a very congested paddock, Interlagos. And suddenly, in among all that throng, that unruly throng, suddenly this little figure in red began to push itself through, almost at hip height, pushing through legs and bums and, you know, getting his way to the front. And up came this hand. He looked at Lewis. Congratulations, Lewis, congratulations. And it was Felipe. I mean, perfect sportsmanlike behavior. Amazingly impressive. I'm still struck by it when I describe it 12 years on.
It's funny how memories like that, Matt, stick in your mind, especially when you've had so many wonderful memories at McLaren. Obviously, being communications director there until 2017 before you joined W Series. But obviously, I'm going to take you back to the video that you did with Mario Muth, a perfect example of, obviously, it was the final season that you were going to be working with Lewis, and it was the final race of the year. It was a difficult season for Lewis in 2012. And I remember you saying that you literally, you didn't know what to say to Lewis. You walked into his room, and the first thing that you did was you gave him a round of applause and gave him the thumbs up.
Yes, of course, that was Interlagos as well, wasn't it? And that was a race that actually Lewis's teammate, Jenson Button, won for McLaren. Still astonishingly, McLaren's most recent Grand Prix victory. But Lewis could have won that race, actually. I mean, they both drove very well, but if it had panned out a bit differently, he could have won that race. And of course, he didn't. And as he, again, the very, very small hospitality area, he walked through it because his room was at the back of the hospitality area, and he walked through. And yes, as you say, I just thought, I'm going to say something. This is the end of this relationship from a professional working point of view. This is the end of what this already, to me, quite clearly wonderful racing driver is going to do for and with McLaren. And yes, I tapped on the door and opened his door, and he was standing there. Actually, he was standing there with his overalls pulled down to his waist and his bare top, still very muscular already in those days, not as many tattoos. And I just looked at him, and he kind of shrugged as if to say, well, that didn't go well, did it? Or it didn't work out. Yeah, and I just... There didn't seem words to say, but all one can do when one wants to give due credit to somebody for an astonishing performance is applaud. It's the right thing to do.
I think, you know, there were a lot of people that were skeptical about Lewis's change to Mercedes. And I remember being on a Formula One related podcast called GP Focus. And I got asked the question, and they said, well, Alex, what do you personally think about Lewis's move from McLaren to Mercedes? And I said, well, it's got to be down to a multitude of factors. If he's getting the right team around him, there is no stopping him. And it was quite funny that someone actually reminded me of that fact just the other day, and they said, you realize that if you'd have bet on Lewis Hamilton, you probably would have had a small fortune by now, that he would have won his 7th world title in 2020. And it just shows that how the sort of like the gestation period that Lewis had, obviously joining McLaren in 2007, in his first season as a rookie, taking not only his first ever Formula One World Championship victory in terms of a race, but also being close to beating both Fernando Alonso and Kimi Raikkonen, who, with the latter being the one that would eventually win that title by, I think, if memory serves me correctly, just a single solitary point, to the man that we see now. He's become very, very much a spokesperson for Formula One, not just in his performances on the track, but how he conducts himself off of it. I mean, the Americans at the moment can't seem to get enough of him on their mainstream media now that he's equaled Michael's World Championship record.
Yeah, I mean, let's just look the first part of your question, his McLaren career. So he was there for 6 years. He won 21 Grand Prix and a World Championship. I mean, on its own, if he'd never done anything else, that is up there. You know, that is a career alongside, you know, the likes of, you know, I don't know, James Hunt, I don't know, Sterling Moss, I don't know, Emerson Fittipaldi, Nelson Piquet. You could name these names which are all-time greats, that tally, 6 seasons, 21 Grand Prix wins and a World Championship, that places you up there alongside those names. Of course, he's now added 73 more Grand Prix and 6 more World Championships, and he'll probably add yet more of both. So astonishing already at McLaren, and very obvious that he was going to be great, was already great and going to be greater. And then, of course, yes, what he's done with Mercedes, and again, it's a team sport, stupendous. And I don't think many people thought that team, which was BAR Honda, and then Braun, I don't think people thought it would end up being the most successful team in the history of Formula One. I don't think many people thought that. But nonetheless, that is what has happened. And he has been there and done the winning and been a central part. You see, I've worked with Lewis. I know that he's not just this brilliant driver. He's also an extraordinarily diligent worker behind the scenes. He works with the engineers. He's technical. He tries to craft his improvement technically. He's a fascinating character. There's much more to Lewis than what you see. You know, if you judge him just by Instagram, then you miss quite a lot. Now, you talked about what he's doing off track and how he's being perceived, not just as a driver, but as a man. And you talked about America, how he's being perceived there. I mean, he's a superstar in America. And I mean, he's a superstar everywhere, but he's a superstar in America. I mean, he's more famous than Formula One in America. And, you know, I do know Lewis quite well, and I'm quite frequently in touch with him. You know, the odd email and so on and so forth. I wouldn't overstate that. You know, I wouldn't say I don't work with him anymore, but occasionally we might have a little bit of friendly interaction. You know, he has taken on board, you know, he's taken on board this statesman-like element to his life. So he can still deliver on track just as well as ever he could. But at the same time now, he's also, you know, this activist, this political activist. I shouldn't say political activist. I should say activist, but not political. I don't see it as political. It's about human rights. Human rights isn't politics. I think he stands for end racism, and he stands for diversity and inclusion. And now he's put his money where his mouth is. And, he started this foundation with Martin Whitmarsh, obviously the ex-boss of McLaren, and other people as well, in order to try to find not only why it is that young black people, BAME people, are not forging careers in motorsport, in engineering and so on, in the way that their white counterparts are, not only to discover why, but also to try and do something about it. And so he does stand for diversity and inclusion, but not only to do with race. You might think it was mostly to do with race because he's a black guy, and why shouldn't he? I'm a gay man. Everybody in Formula One, everybody in motorsport knows that. And I suppose, I am a founder ambassador of Racing Pride, which was set up last year in connection with Stonewall, the LGBTQ+ charity, in order to try to assist and support LGBTQ+ people in motorsport, whether they're drivers, junior drivers, mechanics, engineers, anything else. Now, the reason I mention that, Lewis, who is a black man but a straight man, he retweeted the other day one of my tweets about Racing Pride. Now, obviously that was pleasant anyway, because it meant that that tweet was available to be read by 6 million people, which is an extreme rarity for my tweets. But Lewis's retweet facilitated that. But I also thought it was very revealing. Here is this megastar, heterosexual black man who stands for Formula One, but also stands for Black Lives Matter and end racism, all those things. And there he was retweeting, if you don't mind me saying, a middle-class, middle-aged, white gay man, perfectly happy to do so, because I think he believes in diversity and inclusion in all its forms. And hats off to him for that.
I think also with the recent announcement that W Series will be part of the support grid for Formula One in 2021, also showed the character of Lewis himself with what he was saying about the fact that we do need more females within motorsport. And that was another sign that he is very, very switched on. And I know for a fact that yourself, Catherine, David Coulthard, and everyone involved with W Series was very, very well happy about that news. And obviously the way that Lewis, he handles himself very, very well. He's not afraid to speak his mind.
No, he will not be silenced. I mean, I know the FIA has told him that he can't wear T-shirts with messages which they call political messages, but you might call human rights messages, but whatever you call them, he's not allowed to wear them on the podium, but he wears them in the paddock, therefore. You won't silence Lewis on that. He is now his own man and he will do his own thing. Yeah, of course, we at W Series were absolutely thrilled. We've been working incredibly hard through this difficult year, which became a sabbatical year for W Series. We had a great season last season, our first season, and next season we will have another bigger and better season. Of course, it was disappointing we couldn't race this year, but we weren't alone. Even the mighty Olympic Games wasn't able to run this year. Wimbledon tennis wasn't able to run. The Monaco Grand Prix never occurred. So yes, I know a lot of motorsport has got going again, but we decided to step back, regroup and go again for next year. And we were thrilled to be able to partner with Formula One. And of course, we made our announcement on the Thursday before the Turkish Grand Prix. I mean, I must admit, I chose that day quite carefully, knowing that soon after the announcement was made, the drivers would all be facing media in the Istanbul paddock and media rooms. And duly, they were asked questions about W Series, and I think to a man, they were positive about it. And yeah, look, not just Lewis, actually, let's be fair, all the other drivers said positive things, and I think they meant it. But of course, Lewis, yeah, he is first among equals in Formula One at the moment, let's be honest about it. And he definitely got behind W Series, and the result was, from my point of view, obviously manna from heaven, which was 6 or 7 hours after the initial announcement, which had already made quite a splash in the media. There was a second wave, which is Lewis Hamilton, 7-time champion-elect, as he was then, backs W Series. So job done, all good. But anyway, Lewis wouldn't have been persuaded to do that if he didn't think it was the case. He is his own man.
Yeah. Well, Matt, before we go, we have to give your book a little bit of a bit of publicity on your book, which seems to be doing the round, called The Boy Made the Difference, available through various platforms. And it's really good to see that you've taken authoring a book into a very, very heartfelt but very, very personal story. So if you want to just tell a little bit about the book itself, and so we can close things out here on Downforce Racing.
Well, thank you, Alex, for giving the opportunity for a shameless plug. But what I will say, by the way, is it is all for charity. I won't make a penny piece out of sales of The Boy Made the Difference. My mother died of cancer in 2013, and when she died, I set up a thing called the Bernardine Bishop Appeal. Her name was Bernardine Bishop. And the Bernardine Bishop Appeal fundraises for CLIC Sargent, which is a wonderful charity that helps the situation for children and young people with cancer. And what could be a more deserving charity than that? I decided to write a novel, and I decided that all proceeds would go to CLIC Sargent via the Bernardine Bishop Appeal, and they will, and they already are. Because fortunately it is selling, you know, it's not selling in numbers that J.K. Rowling would envy, but it's steadily clocking up the sales, all of which is going to charity. I'm a gay man. I decided I wanted to write a novel that had nothing to do with motorsport. And I did it in the time between leaving Mclaren and joining W Series. I had about 8-9 months. And I thought, what can I do? I mean, I could have, you know, gone on a few holidays. I did go on a few, I will say, but I could have gone on more. I could have drunk a bit of beer. I did drink some, but I could have drunk more. But I thought, what can I do? I may not have this opportunity again when I've got my health and strength and hopefully a bit of wit still in my brain, and the time and, you know, the financial security to not have to be terrified about paying the bills. So I sat down and enormously enjoyed writing it. And it's set in London between 1989 and 1991. And the next bit I'm going to tell you about is going to make it sound incredibly depressing, but it isn't a maudlin or grim or gloomy book, I promise you. But it is set against the narrative backdrop of the HIV/AIDS crisis in the Western world at that time, which was a killer. And I worked at that time as a home support volunteer, or buddy, for London Lighthouse, which was at that time the largest HIV/AIDS centre in the world, actually. Princess Diana opened it famously. Anyway, I did a lot of voluntary work, and some of it was grueling and some of it was harrowing. You know, I was in my late 20s, but I was helping people in their last days, and quite a lot of them were younger than me. It was a little bit like the First World War, but the difference is the First World War heroes, of course, were venerated, and rightly so, but sometimes young men, usually men, who died of AIDS in the late 80s and early 90s, died despised and rejected, and sometimes entirely alone. It's something that I realized that only 30 years later, quite a lot of people don't really understand. So it's a fictional book. It's not based on a true story. Nobody who appears in it, none of the characters are based on anyone I know. There's no autobiographical element. But of course, I've drawn on my experiences. And it's an interesting story, I hope, of 6 Londoners, men, women, straight, gay, who struggle through that narrative backdrop. I won't give the game away in terms of plot. I'll tell you one thing. Natalie Pinkham, who of course you know very well, Natalie Pinkham, of course, the Sky Sports F1 presenter, dear friend of mine, and she told me, Matt, it made me gasp, laugh, and cry. And I thought, well, if I can make readers gasp, laugh, and cry, and help children with cancer at the same time, it's not a bad thing, is it? So it's available on Amazon. The Boy Made the Difference by Matt Bishop. You can buy it in paperback and you can buy it in Kindle. And your money will be well spent because it will go to charity.
And also all the links will be in the description down below, as well as Matt's official Twitter handle, at the Bish F1, if memory serves me correctly. Matt, thank you very much for your time. And it's been a pleasure catching up as always.
Thank you so much, Alex. Pleasure is all mine.